Are you familiar with a guy named Dimitri Christakis?
No.
He's a pediatric epidemiologist, and he really looks at the long run of pediatrics as they grow up and what affects them in later years, what happens early that affects them in later years. And he's a brilliant scientist. And he says what's happened with, he'd be a great, interesting guy for you to talk to. I've interviewed him 3 or 4 times. He says that what's happened with the handling of the pandemic is going to amount to millions of years of lives lost with these kids that are in school now. Millions of years of lives lost.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what he's talking about is that because of the educational gap that's been created by the pandemic, because of the social developmental gap that's been created, with the competitive gap that's been created, developmental, competitive, educational, that this generation is going to lag behind. And like, for example, if you're not reading on grade level at the end of the 3rd grade, your likelihood of dropping out is 4 times normal. And the reason for that is, for the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, you're learning to read. From the 4th grade on, you're reading to learn. So if you haven't learned to read in those first 3 years, you now don't have the tool to read to learn. And so you start falling further and further behind. And so your likelihood of throwing up your hands in frustration, falling further behind each year and ultimately dropping out. And if you're low socioeconomic or a minority, and your parents don't support education, et cetera, it's 6 times normal. But he's saying that these kids that got so little and lost so much in math, reading, and science during the pandemic with this remote learning, which was a disaster, that they're going to have less educational attainment, which means they're going to get lesser jobs. Lesser jobs are more dangerous jobs because they're more manual labor. They're doing construction work, things where you can get injured. They're going to have lesser insurance, and so you get less treatment, slower diagnosis, more injuries, and and other factors, but as that obtains, that will take years off their life at the end. They might develop cancer, but because they have poor insurance, it might be slower to get it diagnosed, lesser treatment, so it advances further and takes years off their life. They get injured, stress, trauma, and so it may take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years off of each kid's life. And we've got 57 million kids in the public school system right now.